Okay, so the other area of real concern is, in many people's minds, is the risk of hydrofracking on our water resources, groundwater resources particularly. And so let me say a few words about that. The risk to groundwater is not from the hydrofracking itself. The formation, as we've discussed, is very small. The Marcellus, 100 feet thick. Hydrofracks don't go that much further out from the formation. The hydrofracking can only be done 1,000 feet below the top of the bottom of potable water. So, typically speaking, in this area and everywhere, you have a relatively shallow zone of groundwater, maybe about 1,000 feet thick, that's freshwater aquifers. And then below that, the brines that have accumulated are salty. So anytime you have evaporation or whatever, the water evaporates, the salty water drains down and it fills up the bathtub from the bottom, and you have this sandwich of fresh water riding on top of very salty water, non-potable water. The hydrofracking has to be 1,000 feet below that bottom of potable water, and that is a pretty good buffer for any risk that the hydrofracking operation itself would introduce contaminants into the aquifer. So the risk is not there. The risk is in the drilling of the well and the possibility that when you hydrofrack you might get some fluids coming up along improperly cemented annulus of the well, and from surface spills as you truck in the chemicals and whatnot that you want to use for the hydrofracking. And the handling of the return fluids that you get back when you start to produce the well and you clear its throat of water so that it produces gas. The chemicals that you put in to do the hydrofracking are not of great concern per se. They're chemicals that we use for a lot of other purposes, cosmetics that we put on our skin, things that we put in our swimming pools, disinfectants, so on and so forth, this kind of thing. And they're not, by and large, they're bactericides, which may be of some concern, but we use those elsewhere as well. They're not the major concern compared to some of the things that you get back with the fluids that you produce. So you inject these you inject the hydrofracking water with sand and some additives that prevent bacterial growth, make it easier to inject, surfactants that make it easier to inject, surfactants that help with recovery, acid to prevent scaling, this sort of thing. You inject it and you produce the hydrofracks, and then you produce back water that contains the salts and some of the chemicals that are in the natural shale formation. There are heavy metals that can be in that water, like zinc and lead, and more of concern, there can be radium, which is a radioactive element that's a decay product of both thorium and uranium. Uranium tends to be rich in shales because uranium is soluble under oxidizing conditions, and when the oxidized water is hit organic rich material like the Marcellus shale, they can precipitate uranium, and uranium can accumulate. Uranium decays, and the first water-soluble product of that radioactive decay is radium, not radon. Radon is a gas, that's what you have in your house. You may have problems with that, but radium is a dissolved element that behaves very much like calcium. So when you drink radium, it can go into your bones, and having radioactive material in your bones is just not a very good idea. Now the good thing about radium is it's easy to detect and it's very easy to take out if it's there, and in fact it's so easy to take out that it often doesn't get produced in these gas wells. It precipitates out on the well or the well casing or on its way to the surface. The other thing is that the produced water is only about 20% of the water that's injected, because you're injecting water into a dry sponge and you just only get about a fifth of it back. And the water that you do produce back can be recycled to some degree and perhaps completely, so that there may not be that much water to move around or to handle the dangerous stuff, the produced stuff, as one might anticipate. But nonetheless, it is true that if you spilled that on the ground, or if animals drank it, it would be of concern. So that is a risk, and that's a risk that has to be managed and handled.